Now, I can only suspect that many of those in attendance today have been dreading my talk, because it's bound to be about me getting up here and talking about why the West is just so great and why it's so important for us to study the great books of the Western world, blah, 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 etc. And while I might believe all that is true, I'll ease your minds right from the beginning by letting you know that I'm not actually going to talk about that. That's a spiel that we get a lot of at liberal arts school, and it's one that a lot of us are tired of hearing. I'm not going to give the classic, save the classics, save the humanities spiel. In fact, instead I'm going to talk about why I think the very notion of a humanities education, as distinct from scientific education or social scientific education, betrays the nature of human knowledge itself. I argue that studying the classical world is an indispensable part of a higher education because it gives us the framework for questioning certain deeply held but yet unjustified beliefs about the world we live in. These are assumptions that are specific to our own time. And the one I'm going to be focusing on today is academic divisions, science, social science, humanities. I'm going to argue not that we should get rid of these divisions, but rather that we should abuse ourselves of the notion that human knowledge conforms to the same divisions that academia does in the 21st century. The radically different structure of inquiry in the ancient world allows us to see truth not as specific to particular topics, but to knowledge generally, to truths about the world generally speaking. Once we're able to see knowledge as general, we're able to approach modern problems differently and go at it from novel angles. So why do we have academic divisions? At surface level, it seems like it's really just a matter of classification. In the sciences, the natural sciences, we use empirical methodology and study the natural world. In social sciences, we use a similar methodology, empirical methodology, but we study humans and human institutions. In the humanities, we study things that are thought to humanize people, things that satisfy a natural desire to know or to feel. And it seems like the distinction is well warranted. It actually does a good job of classifying. But I want to suggest that historically, this assumption has served to ingrain these sorts of assumptions about knowledge in our mind. And the assumption, namely, that I'm talking about is the idea that different bits of knowledge from different fields are inherently incommensurable. So over here, we've got our social scientific knowledge, and over here is our scientific knowledge, and over in the distance is humanities somewhere, and they're totally separate. This way of thinking, I don't think, is new to the 21st century. And if we look back on European history, for example, we see a similar academic curricular prescription with the trivium and the quadrivium. Now, the trivium means 3 ways in Latin, and that's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Quadrivium means 4 ways, and that's arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So that's what we see in the past, but how did we get to where we are today, which is the relevant question? Well, speculatively, I think it started in the 16th century with the rise of astronomy. Shortly later, physics took a seat at the table, and then chemistry and biology in the next few centuries. Social science is a little bit more new. It's similar to the sciences in its empirical methodology, but closer to humanities in its focus on humans, and that's more recent. The humanities division now is something of a grab bag from the past. You've got your philosophy, your theology, your rhetoric, classics, history, etc., and all those different fields. So, ultimately, what we see with the divisions we have now is not that they are natural to humans, but rather that they are a unique feature of the 21st century. We have the divisions not because it's part of just the human mind to have them, but rather because that's just how academia happened to develop. I recall that the most difficult semester I had at Hampden-Sydney in college was the spring semester of my freshman year, when I simultaneously took statistics, formal logic, and astronomy. Now, when I enrolled in these classes, I thought they were totally different fields of inquiry, and in most ways they are. In statistics, you take data and you manipulate it and organize it. In logic, you look at the principles of sound argumentation, constructing and analyzing arguments. And in astronomy, you look at the question of how do we know about the cosmos? How do we know about the universe? On paper, they offer completely different sorts of information, different sorts of knowledge. But about halfway through the semester, I had this epiphany. And I realized that what I was doing in each of these classes was ultimately just variations on a theme. The theme of inference. In statistics, I was taking survey data, for example, and inferring a conclusion, inferring the significance of it. In formal logic, I was given a set of premises and told to infer or derive the conclusion. And in astronomy, I was given observations. I made observations from pictures of the night sky, and from that inferred the nature of some celestial body, a planet or a star. In each case, I drew an inference. Now we know what category, what academic division each of the classes that I took falls into: math, philosophy, natural sciences. But the more relevant question here is, what division does the concept of inference fall into? And the answer is, I don't think it does fall into a division. Now, ultimately, this was just a realization that ended up being quite useful for me in understanding these topics. But history, I think, gives us a plethora of examples that show that this sort of interdisciplinary insight can be extremely useful. Take the example of Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus was an astronomer who earned his place in the history books by proposing a heliocentric theory of the universe, or the solar system as we now call it, thanks to Copernicus. He said that the sun is at the center and that the earth revolves around the sun. Now, for hundreds of years prior to Copernicus, people believed that it was actually the sun that revolved around the earth. Copernicus was not the first astronomer ever to offer a heliocentric model of the universe, but he was the first of the modern era. And he was proposing this theory right at a time when technology was just getting good enough that reasonably someone could come along and vindicate his theory with observation. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. About 80 years after Copernicus dies, Galileo Galilei comes along, invents the telescope, verifies Copernicus's theory, and gives us reason to think that Copernicus was probably right. But this leaves us with a question. If it wasn't until 80 years after Copernicus died that observation vindicated his theory, then where did the theory come from in the first place? Now, we normally think about science as proceeding from, you got scientists making observations and then inferring a theory from those observations. But Copernicus didn't have a telescope. So where did this theory come from? Well, look to his influences. At the University of Bologna, Copernicus studied under a man named Domenico Maria di Novara, a Platonist astronomer and astrologer. So we know that Di Novara was heavily influenced by Plato. So if we can see a connection between Plato and Copernicus, there might be something there. And interestingly enough, there is. In the 6th book of Plato's dialogue, Republic, Socrates likens the act of doing philosophy to the act of emerging from a dark cave for the first time. Having never been out of the cave and seen light, a person is overwhelmed by the sun's brightness. Similarly, someone who starts taking up philosophy is initially inclined to turn away from it because it's difficult at first, studying the good, the true, the beautiful. The sun is analogized to the good. And there's really a quite dense metaphor here. If you haven't read it, I can't recommend it enough. But another way that it's used is that the sun, just as the sun is in many ways a prerequisite for life on Earth, so is the good, this abstract concept, the prerequisite for the existence of all things. Now, what's really interesting here is that if you read some of Copernicus's language in De Revolutionibus, his book on astronomy, there's some strikingly similar and strikingly metaphorical language. Overdue books, had to make a scam. In this most beautiful temple, who would place this lamp, the sun, in another or better position than that from which it can light up the whole thing at the same time? Where the sun is not inappropriately called by some people the lantern of the universe. It's mined by others, and its ruler still by others. Indeed, as though seated on a royal throne, the sun governs the family of planets revolving around it. Moreover, the earth is not deprived of the moon's attendance. On the contrary, the moon has the closest kinship with the earth. Meanwhile, the earth has intercourse with the sun and is impregnated for its yearly parturition. Placing the sun, rather than the earth, at the center of the universe does not come as the result of some common sense intuition, about the nature of, or the centrality of humans in the cosmos. It comes rather as a fertile extension of a Platonic metaphor, and it came at just the right time in history, because Galileo takes it and runs with it. Now, the point here is not one about Plato, it's not one about Copernicus, and it's not one about the sun impregnating the earth. The point is that Copernicus took inspiration from a literary and metaphysical metaphor to construct a theory that turned out to be extremely well verified. Heliocentrism today is so prominent that its foil, geocentrism, is typically used as an example of a ridiculous belief, some belief that no one holds with any sincerity. Copernicus was thinking outside the box, and he was doing so by making a bold connection between apparently disparate and unrelated fields. So what, you now ask, does anything that I have been saying have anything to do with the enduring relevance of the classical world, the title of the talk? What does all this talk about academic divisions and Copernicus have to do with classics? Well, I'm glad you asked. What future thinkers need is a paradigm of a world that lacks the rigid distinctions in academia that we have now. If I were to ask, what was Aristotle's profession? The obvious answer would be Aristotle was a philosopher. But the more accurate answer would be Aristotle was a biologist, a physicist, a mathematician, an ethicist, a political theorist, a literary critic. The list goes on. Aristotle did a whole number of different things. And the case of Aristotle shows us that the mind is not something that is simply shaped by individual topics, but is rather something that applies itself to multiple topics. Academic divisions are modern constructs that in the grand scheme of things are somewhat arbitrary. They are constructs that a study of the classical world helps us to question. Examples like Aristotle of thinkers whose ideas transcend boundaries abound. You have Herodotus and Thucydides, historians whose works delve deep into the psychological features of historical figures, and whose works outline decidedly philosophical theories of government. You've got Hesiod and Homer, whose poetry was very influential in the construction of later legal systems. Pre-Socratic philosophers like Democritus, Zeno, Parmenides, Heraclitus, whose poetry about the nature of the divine, about the nature of what we now call science, numbers, math, logic, raise questions that we're still grappling with today. There is a vast network of knowledge in the ancient world, but none of these academic distinctions that we have. There's only learning. There's only inquiry. But the critique that I'm leveling here is not in academic divisions. I actually happen to think that the ones we have now are pretty good: science, social science, humanities. The critique I am leveling is at this stay-in-your-lane mentality that seems to pervade academia. As classics departments around the country disappear, this mentality is increasingly entrenched in the world psyche. People say, study science, technology, math, engineering, computer science. Now let me be clear. Studying these topics in the 21st century is extremely important as we face the challenges of poverty, environmental decline, global health emergencies, and a host of others. But just studying them is not good enough. Modern problems require creative solutions, and creative solutions don't come about from just doing one thing in isolation. Now, you might very fairly ask, if this outside-the-box thinking, interdisciplinary thinking is so useful and so important, can you give an example of some solution or some problem that can be solved with this kind of thinking? And the honest and perhaps unsurprising answer is no, I can't. I don't know what solutions lie in the future, but that's exactly the point. We don't know what we lose when we take away our less tangible sources of creativity. Creativity is the result of innovation, unexpected inspiration, bold conjectures that seem ridiculous at first, but stand the test of time. Putting the sun at the center of the universe? Ridiculous? No, not ridiculous, but bold, defiant of modern strictures. Leaving the ancient world in the past is a mistake that we cannot afford to make. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.